This is my remake of a 2019 video which I posted. I posted the old video, but then I decided I had to remake it because some of my ideas have changed. Some of my ideas about how JFK was shot have changed. I now think there was a hit from behind the picket fence. I also now think that J.D. Tippit was not shot on 10th Street. I think he was shot in Dealey Plaza, and that somebody else was on 10th Street. And the gun that was with this somebody else wasn't even J.D. Tippit's gun. And I also have different ideas now about J.D. Tippit's involvement, and I mentioned some of those in the other video, so that's not current either. It changes surprisingly little, actually, in my understanding of Tippit's gun, as I'm calling it here. But it does change a few things, and some of the things I said in the video that I didn't have to say, I shouldn't have said, because now I think they're wrong. And that's the trouble with trying to figure out what happened, is that you have to speculate on some matters, and inevitably you're going to be wrong about some of that. But anyway, I decided to remake the video, so here it is. This is Sergeant Croy waving around J.D. Tippit's gun, we are told. That's what he's doing anyway. He's there with Captain Westbrook and a wallet, which is its own mystery. Well, I have teased out the story of J.D. Tippit's gun from the evidence and connected it to other conclusions that I have about the assassination, and that's what this video is about. And we're starting here on 10th Street with Sergeant Croy in possession of what we are told is J.D. Tippit's gun. And our story starts here with Ted Calloway, a used car salesman in the neighborhood of 10th and Patton. He heard the shots that came from the gun on 10th Street, and he went to the scene, and he helped to put the fallen officer into the ambulance, and then he decided to take the officer's service revolver and go after the suspect, he said. And Calloway told the FBI that he took the gun, a .38 special revolver, and put it in his belt. He said he then got a cab driver who was driving Oak Cliff cab number 213 to drive with him to look for the man he had seen earlier. He said that he never learned the identity of this cab driver, and after they were unable to locate the man he had observed with the pistol, he and the cab driver returned to the scene where Patrolman Tippit had been shot, and he turned Tippit's gun over to Dallas police officers who were at the scene. Well, that sounds pretty simple and straightforward. And he told the Warren Commission the same story, basically, with a few more details. And part of Calloway's story is corroborated by T.F. Boley, a witness who came by after the shooting, and who, by the way, just happened to be a long-time associate, friend, employee of Jack Ruby. Just happened to come by the shooting scene on 10th Street. In his affidavit, he said, "I noticed the officer's pistol lying on the ground under him. Someone picked up the pistol and laid it on the hood of the squad car. When the ambulance left, I took the gun and put it inside the squad car. A man took the pistol out and said, 'Let's catch him.' He opened the cylinder, and I saw that no rounds in it had been fired. This man then took the pistol with him and got into a cab and drove off. The police arrived, and I talked to a police sergeant at the scene. And the sergeant he had to have talked to would have to be Sergeant Croy, because Sergeant Croy was the first officer on the scene." And Domingo Benavides, another witness on the scene, confirmed that Ted Calloway took that gun and went after the suspect with the cabbie. And the cabbie was William Scoggins, who, prior to becoming a cab driver in Oak Cliff, had worked for defense contractor General Dynamics for 15 and a half years. And at the time of the shooting, William Scoggins and his cab just happened to be parked here at the corner of 10th and Patton, where a stop sign just happened to have been flattened by an accident that morning, as if to mark out the spot where he was to park. And Scoggins said that Calloway, who took the gun, was telling him where to go he was driving the cab, and Calloway was telling him where to go. And Scoggins said that they went in the opposite direction of the fleeing suspect. The suspect had gone south, and Scoggins says they went north and a little west. And north and west just happened to be right in the direction where a mechanic at the MacPate garage had witnessed a car that he said he later identified as Oswald in the car, a 1961 red Ford Falcon, he said, and he wrote down the license plate number. So here, according to White, the mechanic, right where Scoggins and Calloway were going, according to Scoggins, in that direction, Lee Harvey Oswald was sitting in a red Ford Falcon. So Calloway is bringing the gun into the direction where this person was seen. And the license plate on this car belonged to Carl Mather. Carl Mather was an old friend of J.D. Tippit, who had just been shot down the street. And he worked for defense contractor Collins Radio, and even prior to this had worked on LBJ's airplane at Andrews Air Force Base. So Calloway and Scoggins are bringing the gun to a car of Carl Mather, or a license plate, a car driven by Lee Harvey Oswald with a license plate of Carl Mather on it. That's the story. So one might think that Calloway is bringing this gun to Oswald, or whoever's in that car. We don't have anyone saying that happened, but that's what this implies. Now, before they had gone off to look for the suspect, according to Scoggins, talking to the FBI here, he had arrived and the officer had been shot. And he says at about this time the ambulance had arrived and there was another young man at the scene who Scoggins thought was a police officer. Now he's talking about Calloway here. So Scoggins is saying that he thought that Calloway was a police officer. This man took the officer's gun and got into Scoggins' cab, and they drove around the neighborhood for 4 or 5 minutes looking for Oswald. At about the time they left, he noticed some other officers were arriving at the scene. While they were looking for Oswald, they met some officers in the area, not at the scene. He told them what they had seen and that they had the officers gone. They were returned to the scene by these officers. So we don't know who these officers are. Presumably they're Dallas police officers in uniforms and such, but we don't know who they are. But the point I'm getting at here is that Calloway, or Scoggins, thinks that Calloway is a police officer, apparently. Well, this is something that just occurred to me, that Scoggins calls Calloway another young man. The only young man being talked about prior to this was the suspect, presumably Lee Harvey Oswald, who was 24 years old at the time. Well, Calloway was 40 years old, and Scoggins was 49. So it seems odd to me that a 49-year-old would be referring to a 40-year-old as another young man in this situation. And the idea just popped into my head that maybe it wasn't really Calloway at this point. And it's a half-baked idea, so I'm not going to go far with it. But it's interesting, I think, that when we hear from Calloway and when we hear from Scoggins, they apparently don't know each other at all. But they're never asked to identify each other. They're never asked to describe each other than, the cabbie and the guy with the gun. So I'm thinking at the moment here that there's a possibility, and maybe I'll explore this at a later time, that it was not really Calloway when Scoggins drove off, and that this was something that was created after the event, the story. It could have been somebody else, another young man, as Scoggins calls him. But back to the video. So Scoggins says that they brought the gun back with them when these officers brought them back to the scene of the shooting. And that's what Calloway says too. Calloway says he turned Tippit's gun over to Dallas police officers who were at the scene. And presumably this is how Sergeant Croy came to be waving Tippit's gun around. I'm not sure how much sense this makes, really, because when they come back to the scene, there are other officers there. Croy is a reserve officer. He's not a real police officer. He's a volunteer police officer. In fact, he doesn't even carry a gun himself. So we can be sure this isn't his own gun he's waving around. But somehow, for some reason unknown to me, Sergeant Croy, who isn't a real cop, is given the gun, while there apparently are other cops around who are real cops. So that's interesting. Now, the Sergeant Croy story, so far as it exists on the official record, comes from his Warren Commission testimony. And this part about what happened in Oak Cliff at the scene of the shooting on 10th Street, it's presented as an afterthought. Ostensibly, they're interviewing Croy because he was in the basement when Oswald was shot. And here in this screenshot, we can see Croy reaching for Jack Ruby's gun here. He seems to like the guns. Maybe it's because he doesn't have one himself. He didn't get Jack Ruby's gun. But this was ostensibly the reason they were talking to Croy. And this part about him being at the Tippit scene only comes up later in his testimony, as if it wasn't something they were planning to talk about. And apparently Croy was the first officer on the scene. He said he was there when they were loading Tippit onto the ambulance. And of course this would be before Ted Calloway had taken the gun and gone off in the cab. So according to Croy's own story, although he's not asked about it, he was there when Ted Calloway took Tippit's gun and went off to catch the fleeing suspect with Scoggins in the cab. So why would Croy let this happen? Croy is the uniformed police officer right there. He doesn't notice that Calloway takes Tippit's gun. Nobody else notices that Croy is there. See, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I want to read this from Croy's Warren Commission testimony. There was a private detective agency. There was a report that a cab driver had picked up Tippit's gun and had left, presumably. They don't know whether he was the one that had shot Tippit or whether the man, I think it was he, brought someone out there. Something. Anyway, he saw it and he picked up Tippit's gun and attempted to give chase or something like that. There was a detective who was an eyewitness. No, he brought the taxi driver back to the scene. Now, I think this is confusion, and that he's talking about Calloway, and that there's no detective agency, because Scoggins thought that Calloway was a police officer, and because he's not wearing a uniform, maybe Scoggins called him a detective, and he may have said that to Croy, and maybe Croy thinks that means he's a private detective, and I think it's some kind of confusion like that in Croy's mind. However, Dale Myers has created a whole new story regarding this. As I understand it, I have not read his book, but I don't think Myers has that right. I think that's just bullshit, and as Myers tends to engage in bullshit. And I think really we're talking about Calloway and Scoggins here coming back. According to Scoggins, officers brought them back, but I think probably it's there's no detective agency at all, that this is Croy confusion. And then down on the bottom it says, I took Tippit's gun and several other officers came up and I turned him over to them and they questioned him. He's talking about Scoggins, the cab driver. And so Croy says he got Tippit's gun, and that's probably why he's holding it there. And but he never says what he did with the gun. He turned Scoggins over to the other officers, but he never says what he did with Tippit's gun. And if you're watching on YouTube, this is the end of part 1.